overwhelmed. There's a few witnesses in the house today. In our household, we've been living with the overwhelming reality of comprehensive exams. This is not something I had ever come across before, but my daughter is pursuing a doctorate, and she is coming to that point. Is it this week? Praise Jesus. This week, 6-hour closed book exam where she has to be an expert on De las Casas, Frederick Douglass, and John Wesley. Has to know everything about them. It's over. It's not something I would ever venture, but each of us venture into things, and sometimes we hit that place where it just gets overwhelming. It just, it's what we're in for, it's what we want to be about, but it just gets to that point where we think, all right, just feels like more than I bargained for. And, there's a whole lot of folks that are overwhelmed by situations not of their choosing. And although Puerto Rico seems to be moving out of the news, the idea that there are 1 million people that still don't have access to clean drinking water, and that this hurricane killed around 34 people, and the non-recovery efforts that have been deliberately forestalled, not only that have not gone as they were meant to be, but have even been blocked by things like the Jones Act, which keep ships from other countries from even docking in Puerto Rico. More than 420 people have died in the recovery at the hands of our United States government. Overwhelming situations in the world. Overwhelming situations in our lives, in our individual lives. Some of us are dealing with caregiving, which sometimes can be or feel almost as overwhelming as the illness that the loved one is going through themselves. So maybe we can relate with the disciples who are also overwhelmed. They're living in an overwhelming situation of massive poverty, widespread poverty, grinding poverty. And Jesus has called them to an incredible mission where they're called to challenge the power structures, the empire that rules with an iron fist. They're overwhelmed, and they ask Jesus, increase our faith. If you're going to give us this huge mission, if you're going to call us into such overwhelming situations, increase our faith. Give us more faith. And Jesus responds to them saying, if you had faith the size of a mustard seed, the smallest of all seeds, intentionally turning their minds away from increasing faith to small faith. What kind of sense does this make? The mustard seed is a well-known parable that turns the tables on the parables of the Hebrew people, the parables of the great cedar of Lebanon. The mustard seed is deliberately small and low to the ground. This morning we're going to look at faith that is small, but also faith that is growing. A mustard seed grows. It's tenacious in its growth. And we're also going to see as we read this parable that it's a revolutionary faith in the deepest sense of the word. So I want to start with small. Why small faith? In our society, we're more accustomed to big power. Big power is what impacts the world. Think about Walmart, for example. Moving into a town, I read a story about a place called Oriental, North Carolina, where they had a grocery store that had been operating for 44 years. And when Walmart moved in, they saw an immediate 30% decrease in sales. So they were struggling for their lives. So they tried sacrificially to lower prices, and Walmart would just lower them farther because they had unlimited resources to use. And so, like happens in so many towns across the United States, the local stores that have been operating for years went out of business. Well, now there's a new phenomenon that Walmarts are also moving out, closing down. 260 in the last year. Leaving towns without grocery stores. Leaving towns 50 miles now from the nearest grocery store. Towns are closing down. We fail to see the destruction of big. We fail to see the way that larger and larger corporate America is destroying the economy. Jesus comes with a vision of small in a world of big. Adrienne Marie Brown has written a book called Emergent Strategy that we're going to be looking at over the next few weeks. And she talks about how even in our social change organizations, there's a great temptation to imitate the ways that power operates in the world. So many of our organizations for working for social change, she says, are structured in ways that reflect the status quo. We have singular charismatic leaders, top-down structures, money-driven programs, destructive methods of engaging conflict, unsustainable work cultures, and little to no impact on the issues at hand. Instead, she says, we're producing burnout, personal drama, mission drift, specifically in the direction of money, stagnation, inability to make decisions. The parable that Jesus introduces, that is not what the disciples were looking for. They were looking for big faith. They were looking for certainty. They were looking for that kind of faith that would help them face the struggles they were facing without the fear that was so moving in their bellies. But this parable that Jesus introduces is a direct challenge, a direct confrontation to the parable of the Hebrew people, the parable of the cedar of Lebanon, the parable that we find in the prophet Daniel, the parable we find in the prophet Ezekiel. The great cedar of Lebanon grows tall and puts out branches so that all the birds of the air can find their nests in its branches. Jesus tells about a mustard seed that also puts out branches and shelters the birds of the air, which is absurd because birds can't live in a mustard bush. If you know what a mustard shrub looks like, birds can't live in there. But Jesus puts out this counter parable. Now, in the parable of Ezekiel and Daniel, the cedar of Lebanon is the empire. It's the great Assyrian Empire or the Babylonian Empire. And it has grown so tall and so arrogant in its might that it comes crashing down in the valley, so that now the birds of the air's nests are right next to the ground. This really reminded me of a parable that our sister Adrienne Shirk shared this week on a podcast that a number of us have listened to. She's just come out with a book, Your Daughters Will Prophesy. And in this interview, the interviewer was asking her about Christian faith. And she was sharing that Christian faith was not really something she grew up with, but it's something she's become very attracted to and has really become very engaged in. And she talked a little bit about her church here in the Bronx and why that's important. But she talked about a distinction between Christian identity and Christian faith. And I'm paraphrasing a little, so you have to talk to her to get the better version of it. But we have taken on a Christian identity that is not what Jesus brought. We've taken on an identity as Christian, as certainty, as big faith, not little faith. Faith that tells us that we are morally superior to other people. This is the faith that's behind the Inquisition. This is the faith that's behind the colonial projects, where Christian people could go into other lands and feel some kind of justification for taking land and enslaving people because they saw themselves as somehow superior. This is Christian identity that's still very much with us in our world today. A Christian identity that would say that we are right and others are wrong, that others are to be condemned because they don't follow the strict ways that we have an understanding of our Christian faith. This Christian identity, this certainty, has become a destructive force in our world, and it's not what Jesus called us to. And as Adrian pointed out in the interview, the early church didn't refer to itself so much as Christian, but as sojourners, as wayfarers, as travelers, as people moving along a way in faith. The faith that Jesus introduces to us is small faith, it's seed faith, and it's growing faith. It's faith that gets inside us and helps us to grow. Jesus uses images from nature to help us see the natural processes and to understand the way that we're called to grow. This sermon series is called Deeper Roots Yield Sweeter Fruits. So we're following this process of Jesus in looking at these natural images. This is an image that comes from farmers out in California who are suffering from drought, who are struggling to keep their crops alive. And they've been experimenting with different ways of growing their crops and have found that by not introducing water at the beginning, that the roots grow deeper, that the plants seek out that water that's way down in the ground. And interestingly, they grow well, and the fruit is actually sweeter because it's less water-based, it's less watery, and the sweetness is more concentrated. So to use this image, deeper roots, not bigger and higher, but deeper roots yield sweeter fruits. And we're putting this images of Jesus, so many natural images of Jesus and parables, in conversation with this book by Adrienne Marie Brown, who does something similar. And I was so struck as I was reading through it about the way that she also uses natural images, images from the world, the way the world works, the way nature works, to help us think in new ways about the way we can be in our organizations, about the way that we can challenge the status quo, not by using the methods of the status quo, but by using the methods that we see in nature. In this book, she shares her own testimony. She says, once upon a time, I was a burnt-out executive director, tied to my technology and my sense of my own importance. When I was with friends, family, lovers, I was still working. I thought I was awesome at multitasking. I would say urgency, obligation, and specialness were driving forces in my life. But in 2012, I took a sabbatical and realized my life is a miracle that cannot be recreated. I became more intentional about deepening my relationship with loved ones. I began to work more collaboratively and realized the importance of learning to practice the world we wish to see. Actually practicing, actually creating the world that we're trying to envision in the work we're doing at the small level. So the book has 6 basic principles from nature that we're going to put in conversation with the 6 teachings about faith of Jesus over the next 6 weeks. And the first teaching is about fractals. The idea that in nature, even at the lowest level, the cellular level, all the way up to the galaxy level, there are patterns that get reproduced. The pattern of the swirl, other kinds of patterns. And that what gets reproduced, or what gets enacted and envisioned and created at the lowest level, at the smallest scale, begins to reverberate throughout society throughout nature and gets created at other levels. This is a very different way to think about engaging the world. That creating something small can have a tremendous impact on the world. Last week, actually it wasn't last week, it was 2 days ago. Seems like a long time ago. But a bunch of us spent some time at Riverside Church with Angela Davis and Michelle Alexander. If you weren't there, and I saw a bunch of us there, a bunch of us were there, but if you weren't there, I would encourage you to go on Union's website on Monday and watch it. I'll tell you, that's the most inspired I've been since I can't remember when. I can't remember when I have been that inspired by two people talking at the front of a church. The conversation was incredible. Angela Davis talked about what it means to try to be a revolutionary. And she spoke in very humble terms about trying to be a revolutionary. And Jesus comes to us with a very humble image about trying to be a revolutionary, a small mustard seed, but that grows a plant that completely overturns the way that the world works, the way that power operates in the world. In this parable, Jesus uses a mustard shrub. You know, Luke and Mark tell the story differently. And it's very interesting how each of them tells it. Luke tells it kind of ironically. He tells it, this little mustard seed grew into a tree. Well, that's ridiculous because everybody knows that mustard seeds don't grow into trees. But he was kind of symbolically connecting it with the great cedar of Lebanon of the Hebrew Scriptures. I love personally the way Mark deals with it. I mean, he doesn't talk about a tree. He talks about a mustard shrub. He calls it the great mustard shrub, which is just hilarious. You know, the idea, I mean, you've ever seen these big trees, right? A giant sequoia out in California, or the cedars of Lebanon. These trees, when you see them, I mean, they look like the Empire State Building. You know, they're so big around, you can drive a car through them. They're so high up in the air, you can't even see the top of them. Incredibly majestic, powerful, striking trees. And for Jesus to talk about the great mustard shrub. Mustard is a weed. Farmers hate mustard. When it gets in the garden, it takes over, just like weeds do. It grows everywhere. It's tenacious. It grows low to the ground. Imagine the difference in the hierarchies of the world and the way we understand power as cedar of Lebanon, and the way Jesus is presenting new ways of organizing society, new ways of being together, new ways of organizing and doing work in our communities that is low to the ground, that is tenacious, that is growing, that is branching out, that's taking over. The farmers don't want mustard in their garden, and the powers that be don't want organizing in their communities because it takes over. It offers a vision that people begin to get attracted to. They're not so interested in looking up at the top of the cedar of Lebanon anymore because they've got tree moving and growing right in their space, right in their community that empowers them, that they can get up on that branch. They can become a part of it. They can grow with it. I want to share a couple of things that were just really moving to me about Angela Davis's talk. And they showed a film clip of her in 1970 talking to Cecil Williams, the pastor at Glide Church, in Glide United Methodist Church in San Francisco. And Angela said she'd never seen that clip before. She watched it, and she was kind of laying out her vision, and she was saying, yeah, my vision hasn't really changed much. What does it mean to try to be a revolutionary in this world? It means not trying to reform the prison system. She wants to abolish the prison system. That's the difference between reform and revolution. Now, a lot of us recoil from that because we've been so inundated in a society where reform is the only option. You know, we live in a democratic society, and the way our society is structured is a given, and that's the only way it can be structured. And you tinker around the edges a little bit and try to make it a little better, and then the other party comes in and they tinker a little bit and take it back the other way. And Jesus just blows that out of the water. He says, we're not having this tree anymore. We're replacing the tree. The tree is going to be taken down. It's going to be replaced by a completely different structure that looks nothing like the one that we currently have. It's a revolutionary parable. It's not a reformist parable. And Angela Davis was talking about we need to abolish the prison system. She said the prison system is not the kind of security we need, but we've come to think that it's the only option. But there are many different ways to get the security we need. And people asked her all kinds of questions about, Michelle Alexander asked her questions about, well, what about when somebody's been murdered and, you know, they need a sense of safety? And she went in around that and shared her own experience with that kind of thing, but said that, you know, really wrestling deeply, we need a new conversation. This is the faith that Jesus is calling us to. And it speaks to me I had a revelation while I was at Riverside Church that night. I've thought many times, wow, what if I could have been there when Dr. Martin Luther King rose up into the pulpit at Riverside Church and gave his speech, Why I Opposed the War in Vietnam. Boy, if I could have been there. If only I could have been there. And all of a sudden, Friday night, I realized I was there. There was nothing any less powerful about that night. I wasn't there with what she was putting out, what she stands for, who she has been throughout these decades, is none less powerful. And I was so struck by this 73-year-old woman who is so vibrant and so full of life. And one of the main issues I'm dealing with in my life is my tendency toward curmudgeonliness. As I enter into my 60s, I have a tendency to move toward the curmudgeonly. And it's not a place I want to go, but it's a place I feel like going sometimes. Now, you know what a curmudgeon is, right? Everybody know what a curmudgeon is? You know what a curmudgeon is? Okay. Such a great word. A curmudgeon is usually an old man, usually, doesn't have to be, but usually an old man who is so stuck in his opinions and the way things used to be done, and that he's just stuck. You know, there's just no moving forward, and it's just kind of a gradual movement into rocking chair and the way things used to be, kind of like that, you know? And I was on the elevator the other day in my building, and this woman got in that Becky and I see all the time, and we always smile, and we have these little elevator conversations. She gets in the elevator. She goes, 4 more years, 4 more years. And I knew exactly what she meant. She said, I'm 62. I'm retiring in 4 years. And I was just like, yeah, I hear you, you know. Man, well, you get in those early 60s. Now, folks who are past that, you know, have gone on to another stage. But that early 60s, man, you start owning your curmudgeonliness. Oh, boy. What I've done in my life, I deserve a good rest. Yes, I do. And then you sit there with Angela Davis at 73. And I didn't see any spider webs or cobwebs growing on her rocking chair. And I started to think, you know what? You know what I'm tired of? I'm tired of reform. I'm tired of tinkering around the edges. That's what I'm physically tired of. I'm tired of trying to fix things that can't be fixed. I'm tired of having conversations with bureaucracies that are going nowhere. That's where cynicism sets in. But you know what I'm not tired of? I'm not tired of revolution. I'm not tired of the gospel of Jesus Christ that comes to bring us the seeds of an entirely new way of being and a calling to live life in a way that is so completely different than the ways of the world. A way that is authentically based on loving one another and loving God with all our heart and mind and soul and strength, of letting go of the things that bind us, of letting go of our fears, of stepping into a faith that is the size of a mustard seed. There is no certainty here. There is nothing about taking on this faith that suddenly makes everything make sense. As a matter of fact, the questions only grow. The questions only grow. And that was one of the things Adrienne shared in her interview, was that she said, I'm in for a faith where the questions are alive always, always the questions. The faith is calling me to question, to grow, to be revolutionary. That's our calling, that's our invitation, and that's energetic. That's powerful. And it's small. And it starts right where you live. It starts right in your family. It starts right here among us. It's an opportunity to create something real with a faith that it will transform the world. Gracious God, we may not have been looking for a little mustard seed. We may have been looking for a more comfortable ride. But God, what you're offering us is something that's growing. Something that transforms our lives and the world around us. We open ourselves, God, to hear your word. We open ourselves, God, to observing the way your world works and to being in it, to living in it. God, we give you thanks for faith the size of a mustard seed. Amen.